Hi there, it's Marla at Narrate. In this week's message, Adam asks, are you satisfied with your level of connectedness? Does having a Sabbath mindset help us in feeling connected to God as well as other people? Enjoy the second message of the Slowed Down Spirituality series.
Might be the most painful series video we've ever done. And it's on purpose. Hey, if you missed it last week, just want to let you know before we jump into this series that the Backyard Initiative from Christmas Eve, thanks for those of you who are part of it. So last week and this, we will have distributed right around $7,500 to Bryant School, another $7,500 to the Drug Treatment Court. They showed our gifts for a couple thousand, and then we kept about 1,000 back so that we can capture some of those experiences on video, so that we can just add fuel to everything that we're doing there and celebrate and give people the chance to know what's happened. So thanks for being a part of that. We don't all get to be Hannah and deliver those checks, but thanks for being a part of that, and we hope that we can continue to kind of speak that ownership as this time unfolds. We're working really hard to send Lenny. Sorry if you don't know Lenny, but if you know Lenny, this will be funny. Lenny is our guy who we hired to do lots of our video stuff, who's a dear friend, who's very introverted and very artistic and very single and very childless. And we are working really hard to get him on the bus to Yellowstone Park to capture that whole experience on video, which if we do that, I want a video of Lenny. So we want the Yellowstone Park video, but then we need the video of Lenny as well. So this last October, I was in Portland. Some of you know that I get to do that, take these classes from George Fox as an alumni, and the council's graciously given me that opportunity. And I was having coffee with Dr. Nijay Gupta. I don't know why I say his name like that, because he was born in Pennsylvania. But I was having coffee with him before I flew out, which means I had 1 foot out the door and 1 foot fully engaged in the conversation, because I'm the type of person who can't get to the airport too early. And so I was trying to figure out how long I could have this conversation and still get to the airport 3.5 hours before my flight left. But early airport people, how many of you are like, you just can't be to an airport too early? And how many of you are like, I don't want to be at the airport except for 2 seconds before my flight leaves? See, you guys are crazy. That's what you are. There's no good reason to do that to yourself. So we're having coffee, and actually I was asking him some questions that I think are pretty important questions that we're going to start getting into at Easter, where I'm surrounded by people who are asking really important questions about the cross and sacrifice and child abuse and things like that. There's some complicated things related to the way we think about the cross and what it means. And so I just wanted to begin to ask him those questions. I didn't mean to put an elephant in the room, but we're going to start getting after that at Easter. And one of the things he said in that conversation was one of those things that it didn't immediately strike me as important, but you know how sometimes people say something and it's not till after the fact that you start, the thought just lingers. And one of the things he said is, when speaking to the gospel, he said, Adam, the way I understand the gospel is it compels me to, before I say anything about Jesus to someone, to say, are you satisfied with your life? And he said, what I've found is if a person says yes, then I have no good reason to shame Jesus or cram Jesus down their throat, to shame them into Jesus. But he said, if a person says no, then there, he said, I think then Jesus is well worth your consideration. And the posture and kind of tone and direction of that question, I think, serves as a launching pad of what we want to talk about this morning, because this morning I want to talk about connection and community, and yet it's one of those things that easily becomes shaming. Now, if you weren't with us last week, we started this series called Slowed Down Spirituality, and what we began to talk about last week is what if Jesus' form of spirituality is a spirituality that can help us slow down? What if the need of the day is for a slowed down spirituality? One that rescues us from this kind of frantic, frenzied pace where we're constantly busy but never thoughtful, constantly surrounded by people but never really relating or connecting, constantly doing, and yet never present. Last week we talked a lot about consumption and production and this God who invites us to be about more than that. We tried to speak about the iPhone and how that might be impacting our souls. By the way, if you Google, not now but later, one of the founders of the iPhone was recently interviewed by CNN Business, I think it was. There's about a 4-minute video where one of the developers of the iPhone talks about the downside of the iPhone and what we're going to have to do to compensate for it. Absolutely compelling and very, very convicting and challenging. Anyway, there's another side note thing. This morning, what I want to start talking about is how slowing down impacts the way we connect with others. And so here's the question I want to ask. Are you Are you satisfied with your level of relational connectedness? And I mean that genuinely. The last thing that I want to do is get up here and convince those of you who are that you shouldn't be. Now, I don't know what that means you do with the rest of the morning. Maybe note that we have 2 burnt out light bulbs and it's driving you crazy because you're type A. I don't know what you do. It might be because if you're not dissatisfied, then it's probably because you're an expert, and experts tend to learn new things about their expertise, so maybe there'll be something you can glean. But for those of you who aren't satisfied, what I want to do is provoke a conversation that relates to this idea of slowing down. A couple decades ago, I think it was released in 1997, which feels weird to say a couple decades ago in 1997 in the same sentence, because that's the year I graduated high school. Larry Crabb, a Christian psychologist, well-respected in his field, at the time one of the more popular Christian authors and speakers, decorated in the academic world for teaching, he wrote a book called Connecting. And in the opening pages, it might be the first page of the book, Larry Crabb says that this book will be for him what he calls occupational suicide. Now here you have a psychologist, and what he's saying, his thesis, is that if people actually did this, he might go without work. Now, that's not a shot at therapy or psychiatry or psychology. If you know me or us in any way, you know that you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone or any organization that feels more strongly about the value of therapy and professionals and the science in that realm. We are constantly recommending people to therapy. We don't even do biblical counseling because none of us are trained in it. And quite frankly, I think we can together do Jesus and following him together in friendship, and we let the scientists be the scientists in psychiatry. So I'm not anti-psychiatry or psychology. But his thesis was simply this, that his office is constantly full, less because people have the need for answers they don't have, and more because they're isolated and alone. And his thesis throughout the book is, if people were more effective, if we were more effective at doing connectedness, and by the way, his definition of connectedness involves 3 things. It's an environment that's regular. It's an environment where you're fully known. There's no holding back. There's no being superficial. It's an environment where there's grace, where your failures are just as known as your successes, and the grace of God who loves in spite of you is modeled and represented in that environment. His thesis is, if more of us had those types of regular interactions in existence relationally with people, then the overall need for therapists would go down, because his argument is, people are after things that relationships provide, but they don't often know that. Question: hearing all that, are you satisfied with your level of relational connectedness? And again, my point is not to tell you shouldn't be or you should be, but just to go, I think we have to ask this question. Now, for me, one of the single most helpful things I've ever heard about relationships, because FYI, I'm not an expert in the field. I'm a D- at best, and that's only because I'm human. So don't see me as one who's got this figured out. But one of the best things and most helpful things I ever read was written by a guy. I tried to come up with a trivial way to illustrate this, because this guy, Joseph Myers, he wrote a book called The Search to Belong. Few books have influenced the culture of this place more than Joseph Myers' Search to Belong. Joseph Meyer, it's a book worth reading, by the way. It's not one of those books where you're like, I should have just read the pamphlet. But his point, he reaches back into sociology, which of course studies what it means to be human and how we interact and things of that nature. And what he observed, and this was he was very much criticizing the church of the 1990s and the 2000s that kept saying to people, well, you need a small group. You need a small group. Like, you're lonely, you need a small group. His argument was, what we keep doing is telling people there's one type of relationship and there's not one type. There's several types of relationships, and you can be really good at intimate relationship, but if you're not good at these other relationships, you'll still feel lonely. So his argument from the sociology was that we all have, hence the reason for this somewhat cheesy illustration, that we all have the need for public relationships. And public relationships he defines as experiences that we share with people where we don't even necessarily know those people's names. So going to a game, going to a concert, this for many of you. Many of these people, you don't know their name, nor do you care to. In fact, part of it is, if it was just you and 3 other people, it wouldn't be the same experience. So despite the fact that you don't necessarily want to know everybody's name, it's being in a public experience together that makes it worthwhile for you. And he talks about there's this huge need in the human situation for public relationship. This is why community becomes so important. So see if I can do this right off of Martha Stewart. But I did want to create this visual because literally this has been a super helpful visual for me. So then he says, the next type of relational need we have, let's just square that up in case we're type A. The next type of relational need that we have, he calls social. Now, in social relationships, his metaphor, and I love the way he works this, because he goes from still photographs to the video archives. So he says in social relationships, people know who we are. If you see them at Costco, you wave and go, hey, I think they go to Narrate. Or they're people that you work with, perhaps, that you know their name, and you might say hi to them at the water cooler, but you're not necessarily going to talk about what's going on in the throes of parenting or anything else. They're just people that you know. Maybe you've coached with them, or maybe you've seen them across the field at your kids' events. Maybe you're on team with them or in class with them, but you get the idea. You know enough about them to be dangerous, but not necessarily accurate. Those are what we call social relationships. Then, Kate was like, what are you doing with the boxes? Then there's what he calls personal relationships. And quite frankly, if he's accurate, most of what we call our best friends or even in many cases our spouses, they belong in this box. Now here his metaphor moves from still photography to 15 or 40 or 90-second vignettes, short videos. You know, we share experiences with these. Maybe we do things with them. We have them over for dinner. Maybe we grab a beer with them or a coffee, or maybe we're on a team with them, but it's more extended. They're one of the closer friends on the team. We do life. These are our close friends. And he would say we have the need for these people. There's just that little ring. Are you getting that, Jamie? Just a little tiny, like someone might start scratching their eyes out of their head, kind of little feedback, and then I won't say another word. Sorry to put you on the spot. And then he talks about intimate relationship. Intimate relationship, and I think one of the real convicting things about this is he says we all too quickly assume that we even have one of these relationships. That just because you're married doesn't mean you have one. This isn't a sexual thing that would include that perhaps, but not always. But an intimate relationship would be, this is the person who's seen you lose your temper. This is the person who's seen you at your worst and your best. They know it. Like they've got the key to the archives, and they could watch any of the videos, and they've seen most of them. Now, part of what he points out, and part of what I found helpful about this as a Christ follower, is part of his argument is we need them in proportion to each other. That for every one intimate, we need 2 personal and 4 social and 8 public. And that one of the struggles we have is we become really good at one of them. And so we solve our relational issues by just creating more of them, more of them, more of them. And yet if we undervalue any of these other things, we just continue to perpetuate our loneliness. Part of his challenge is identify which are the ones you value less and work on those. Part of what I love is that there's this proportion thing. Part of what I loved as a Christ follower and what was helpful to me is, I don't know if you ever went through this, but there's this assumption oftentimes in church community especially that if you really love Jesus, every relationship moves from this, or at least social, to intimate. Like that it's your divine mandate as every person you meet, you're supposed to get them into this box. And part of what he's illustrating is that's not possible. In fact, part of what he's illustrating is that relationships will naturally move different spaces. Someone gets a different job, someone moves, someone gets divorced. Things happen and relationships change spaces. And that's not always a personal indictment. It's just life. Part of what I love about this is it simply illustrates that this whole lonely and connectedness thing is far more complicated than perhaps any of us ever realized, and it's why it's so difficult to get up to this question. Go ahead, next slide. Are you satisfied with your level of relational connectedness? Because it's not a two-dimensional question. It's incredibly complicated. But to the degree that you're going, actually I'm not. This is where I wonder if Jesus and his principles of slowing down can help us. I want to go back for just a second to where we left off, last week in Exodus. Last week we talked about Exodus and this Pharaoh God figure who kept saying to the people, work, work, work. Your only existence is to produce and to consume. And we talked about this God who rescues us from this, that out of this relentless narrative and the relentless production schedule of Pharaoh comes the God of the burning bush who says, hey, I've heard your hopeless, oppressed cries, and I want to rescue you. What I want to do for just a second, I got to grab the whiteboard, is look back at what you may know as the 10 Commandments. But there's something that I think, for me, this was a game changer when Walt Brueggemann pointed it out, that we can see about the wisdom of what God is saying here. And maybe for you, as you're trying to figure out your own connectedness, maybe this observation, let me get more into the light. So, verse 3. First command, you shall have no other gods before me. So I'm going to do this patronizing thing where I write them down because there's something that I want to. So no other gods. How's that? Verse 4, you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the water below. So number 2, many of you know this as no graven images. Not that you can read that, but at least it helps me. Verse 7, you shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. So the third command, there's this no misusing of the name. 4, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Now, part of what you can observe if you're reading this in your text or you're looking at it on your phone, pretending that you're not looking at the scores or what's about to happen later this afternoon, is that this fourth command gets more page space, more time. There are more words in this fourth command than any of the other 10, which hints at something the rabbis would say. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor male or female servant. So notice it doesn't just benefit you, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord God blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So verse 4, or the fourth one, we've got the Sabbath. I wish we had like Vanna White or something. I could read, she could write. Verse 5, honor your father and mother. So 5, and there's lots of elbowing going on now. Honor father and mother. 6, you shall not murder. Okay? No murder. Lots of no's coming up here. You shall not commit adultery. No adultery. And then Jesus comes along and blows up what that even means. Verse 8, you shall not steal. No stealing. Don't know how I spelled that. It's English and then it becomes Arabic right at the end. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. Number 9, no false testimony. See, you've criticized your teachers your whole life. This is far more difficult to actually write legibly. And verse 10, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male or female servant, his ox or his donkey, or anything that belongs to him. So 10, no coveting. Now, lots of conversation about how do we categorize these. It seems that the most common is to go, this is about loving God. This first 3, and maybe you've heard first 4 are about loving God. I want to challenge that for just a second. So the first 3 commands, loving God. Last 6 commands, loving people. And for thousands of years, and still to this day, the question people ask is, so where does the Sabbath go? Like, does the Sabbath go with loving God? Does the Sabbath go with loving people? There's implications of both in the command itself. How do we categorize this? Here's what Walt Brueggemann and many scholars that he quotes, the rabbis, here's one of the ways they talked about it. They talked about the Sabbath being the bridge to these other 2. That it's in the principle of what we're calling slowing down. It's with the practice of Sabbath that we actually find the time to do this and to do this. The question that I want to ask this morning is, to whatever degree you're not satisfied with your connectedness, what if the problem has much to do with this principle of slowing down? What if there is a tight relationship between all of these things? This last Monday, along with a couple friends, I got to go to the drug treatment court and observe that. It's open to the public. You should go. I'm going to try to get there often, at least on 4-week rotations when all 3 phases are there. But it's about a 3-hour commitment, and no exaggeration, it was one of the single most awe-inspiring things I've done in the last several years. Entertaining, because Judge Reynolds is hilarious. Awesome, because the level of work being done is just appropriately, divinely awesome. For those of you not familiar, what it is there's 25 to 30, I think, is the max number of clients that they can have. These are people who are convicted felons. As Judge Reynolds says, these aren't people who got caught smoking a joint over the weekend. These are people who, were it not for this court, would probably be sitting in Deer Lodge or the women's prison or something like it. And mostly they're people who lack the relational support system that most of us would have if we found ourselves in this situation. And so the official staff of 6 comes alongside, along with this vast host of other parole officers and other people, therapists, who just give these people insane support. It is stinking awesome. First of all, it's challenging because almost every person in that room, if they were sitting next to you, you wouldn't just stereotype them as a meth addict or a heroin addict. Very normal people just like you and I. But what was awesome about it was the level of relational connectedness. One by one, they come up before Judge Reynolds, and he's got a folder full of all the feedback from all these people that serve these people during the weeks. He's got evidence of their UA tests and whether or not they've made their AA and NA meetings, and he's got evidence, he's got documents from the parole officer and other people saying what kind of conversations they have and how they're doing, and are they working? They have to be involved in work and or education, if not both. And he just starts up by going, so what's going on? And of course, every person has a different personality, and those exchanges all look different. One woman came up, just to illustrate, and she was about as melancholy and dry as you could possibly be. And she got up there, and he's like, so, what's been going on? Nothing. I mean, you could barely hear nothing going on, super dry. And finally, he said, and this just kind of speaks to the level of treatment that these guys get, he said, well, last time you were here, we ordered you to try some new things. What'd you try? And she's like, she kind of hemmed and hawed. She said, well, I took my daughter swimming. And he's like, was that fun? And he said, for her. And he's like, what else did you try new? And I think there was maybe one other thing, and then she was just out of ideas. And one of the gals who's in the program with her, she piped up from the back like, oh, we went to the Pizza Ranch and played in the arcade. And she's like, oh yeah, we went to the arcade. I left the winner like super dry. I got a unicorn. What else did you try? Nothing. She couldn't think of anything. Again, I think it was this girl piped in, no, remember we spent the day of the big storm helping people get unstuck. And suddenly her entire countenance just changed. She said, oh yeah, we spent, I don't know whether it was that Friday, she didn't necessarily get super specific, but the day we got all that snow, she said, oh yeah, we spent that day helping people get unstuck. And then she kind of alluded that she might have drove some of their cars sometimes, and then there's like, whoops, was I supposed to say that? And there was this hilarious exchange where she began to share, and her entire demeanor changed as she enthusiastically shared how they spent the day in the cold weather in these horrendous situations helping people get unstuck. And Judge Reynolds goes, well, let the record show, or something like, swimming, boring, going to the arcade, boring, helping people get unstuck, you like that? It was awesome. It was absolutely awesome. In fact, I was telling this story to a friend, and he's like, Adam, that's what we're talking about in this series. That we've been led to believe that what's fun and fulfilling is a screen. That's what's fun and fulfilling is this kind of abstract, artificial entertainment. But what we know is what's fun is the kingdom. Whether we know it's the kingdom or not, serving people, that's rejuvenating. But my bigger point in this is this. What stood out to me, and I'm not an expert. I did hear one scary comment where I was told that one of the addiction counselors, who was himself a meth addict at one point, or herself, I don't even know whether it's a him or a her, the way she describes the addiction is she says, the first time you get high, it's unlike any high you've ever had in your life, and the rest of the addiction is trying to reproduce that first high. But part of what stood out to me was that for these people to really get on the bike, and that's Judge Reynolds' metaphor, they first and foremost have to acknowledge their self-sabotaging tendencies. And it's severe. There were a couple guys who were kicked out of the court, out of the system, because they're not willing to do that. I asked one of the guys afterwards, so what's that one guy, what's he looking at? Because he's not going to do this program that's about 2 years. And he said, 5 to 10 years in Deer Lodge. So the stakes are high, but what he shared was that, or what's obvious as you watch, is it absolutely necessitates that a person become aware that they have self-sabotaging tendencies, or at least that they discover, as in the case I think of what the judge is doing with this thing, is that there's more to life than getting high. Here's my question. What if, when it comes to our connectedness, what if we have our own self-sabotaging addictions? And I don't mean to be that guy. But what if our own convictions about what is fulfilling, what is relaxing, what is rejuvenating, what if we have a tension here? Because we think that if we don't get our 3 hours of TV time on Thursday night, then we're going to be tired on Friday, and yet then we feel lonely. And when we actually do spend time with people, we have a different experience on Friday, don't we? Like, what if part of this, to whatever degree your connectedness is for you a problem, what if it requires that we go like, well, my problem is I don't create space for people? Because see, here's what scholars would say is that really what you can do with the 10 Commandments is to say, get rid of this, literally, figuratively, the practice and the literal thing, however you want to look at it, get rid of that, and you get rid of that. Because when you get rid of this, what you have time for is production and consumption, as defined by the culture and your own family of origin and other things. But when you keep this, then you actually create space for this and for this. Question, what if to whatever degree you're not feeling connected, It's not that everybody around you hates you. It's not that there's nobody around you who you could be friends with. It's not that there aren't opportunities. It's that you have self-sabotaging addictions, whether they relate to your work or to your definition of what's relaxing, and that is your undoing. Which would lead to this question, okay, so what happens when we slow down? Like what are the benefits of slowing down? And again, I'm not an expert here, and I genuinely hope that this sparks conversation, because again, it's relative. You might go like, I don't have any problems. Great. I'm not here to tell you that. We recognize that not even all of you are here for relationships. I myself was a part of a place like this where for 2 years, all I wanted was sit in the back row and hide because you people were too weird for me to even want to be your friends. So we get that as well. But to whatever degree you have this kind of unnerving disconnectedness, what happens when we slow down? Well, here's one idea, and you'll come up with your own, but I wonder if, number one, we share meals and experiences. Like, when's the last time you invited somebody over to dinner? Exactly. It's kind of a lost art, right? Let me ask you this. How many of you are afraid to invite somebody over to dinner because your house is too dirty? Go ahead, raise your hand if your house is too dirty and that would keep you from, you're a bunch of liars. How many of you what keeps you at bay is your kids' sports schedule? How many it would be like you're insecure about your culinary skill? Yeah. How many of you would it be that you're afraid they'll stay too late? That's mine, yeah. You see, because we got to come up with these nonverbal cues like, okay, it's time for you to leave. Like, I just turned the lights off and I'm brushing my teeth. Something along those lines. My point would simply be that we're in this together. But read old literature, read the text. Where did community happen? It happened over a meal. I think one of the real prophetic struggles that we should have with communion even is the way we've turned this meal into a piece of artificial bread that gets stuck in your molar. Seriously. Is our convention even close to what God had in mind as it relates to remembering him? Why is it that so much of what Jesus did and we read about in the Gospels happened around meals? I had my friend Fred in Billings once was working with a pastor who things were just coming unwound, and he just looked at him and said, I think what you need to do is get more feet under your dinner table. It takes time. It does. It's a struggle. It's hard. Here's one of the things that I've learned is if you wait until Thursday to ask someone to dinner on Friday, it'll never happen. If you wait till Thursday to ask someone to lunch or coffee or to grab a beer after work or whatever on Wednesday, it'll never happen on Thursday. But the great thing that we can leverage about our iPhones and email and stuff is you can send an email that goes, hey, do you want to grab dinner in February? Which makes it really hard to say no, by the way. So there's that trick as well. But what I've found is if I've scheduled it weeks out, I mean, we live by calendars. That's what we do, right? And so we show up like we show up to the gym, and when we leave, we're like, wow, that was worth it. I'm glad I did that. When's the last time you had somebody over for dinner? What happens if TV on Friday night isn't an option? What happens if those devices that you think are your source of rejuvenation, what if you just considered like one night a week and just compared the results of the next morning when you did what you normally do versus the next morning when you actually like socialized, did something, went and experienced something together? I want to get too preachy, but what I see from where I sit across the table from people all the time, and I have this good news, bad news conversation because the theme is I'm lonely, and I feel like I'm the only one that is lonely because everyone else hates me. And I get to deliver the good news as, well, here's the good news. Everybody I meet with feels like you. Here's the bad news. Nobody asks anybody to do anything. To the degree to which you step out of that will serve not just you, but others. The other one, what happens when we slow down? Well, I wonder if that means we become more regular, which has nothing to do with fiber or anything like that. But seriously, there are environments, I'm going to venture to guess, there are environments, this may or may not be one of them, that are filled with people who you would love to have greater connection with, whether that's work or at the gym or on your team or in your class. That you find yourself in rooms full of people that you would love to know more, right? But what happens when you're not regular within those environments? I tell you, I see it all the time. I see people who resent me in this place because we haven't provided the relationships that they want, and the honest truth is, you're here once a month. And you're sitting on one side of a person that you would love to get to know, and on the other side of the person is someone who's here 3 or 4 times a month. And if you're the person in the middle, who are you going to take a chance with relationally? Listen, I don't, let's just use church as an example, and if you've been around here for any length of time, you would already know, but if you're a guest, you wouldn't, that we are the last place in the world to kind of go like, you should be here every week or else God disowns you. We do not want that culture, have never wanted that culture. I do wonder, though, if we've fully considered the cost-benefit of being regular in an environment like this, for example. I see people who a year later are hugely connected, and one of the most obvious common denominators is they're here week after week. And then I see people who 3 years later, they're leaving because they're frustrated because they don't know anybody. And what's the common denominator? They're here 3 times in a row and then not for 2 months and then once again a month. And again, I realize that relationships is only one piece of that. So if you're like, I'm not even here for relationships, great. I'm not trying to shame anyone, but just have this conversation. In fact, I listened to an interview recently with a pastor and who I'm really starting to relate to and I really like, and I won't get into it too much. But he thinks about church and does church similar to us. Like he's one of those guys who doesn't really like church, but he's leading a church. Who loves Jesus and is trying to create unique kind of environments, and those are really hard for me to find theologically, where there's guys who are doing the ecclesiology, the church part that I can learn from. And I can't think of his name right now, but when I do, I'll tell you. But one of the things that the interviewer asked him is, so why local church? Why not just follow Jesus without the church structure? Because it comes with a lot of pain and a lot of baggage, and it's messy. And he said, well, that's all very fair. He said, so this interviewer said, so what do you say to somebody who says, I'm going to follow Jesus without church? And he said, I affirm to them that that's easily done. Most people who have those intentions, the data's in your favor. And he didn't give his source, but he referenced data, that the majority of people who say, I'm going to follow Jesus without the local church, now we have to define what it means to follow Jesus and what church means, but that's saved for Easter. Nonetheless, that they can do that successfully. But then he said, but I also like to tell them, your kids don't have the same odds. That statistically, if you're going to do Jesus without church, it's the minority of people's kids who as adults will follow Jesus. And he said, it's not a shaming thing for me. He said, I just want them to know that. You're going to do that, you're going to do the Jesus without church thing? Yep, that can totally be done, and we could argue that might even be better, whatever you want to say there. But the likelihood that your kids take Jesus seriously as adult, less than 50%. And then he said, and I think it's worth pointing out to those guys that the data would say that it's almost impossible to expect that their grandkids will follow Jesus. So just know, he says, that if you choose to make regular church a nominal part of your life or no part of your life, that you're essentially choosing that 2 generations later, your family will not look to Jesus for cues on how to live. Now, I'm not trying to shame you. There's lots of great churches. If you feel shamed, go find one of those. My point is simply this: have you considered in your loneliness and isolation the value of being regular, of just showing up? And if it's not here, whether it's the gym, wherever those environments are where you sense there's people there that you'd like to share life with, what happens when the value of being regular kind of trumps the value of your recreation schedule, kind of trumps the value of, we don't have anything else going? And I'm not saying there's not a balance there, but I have lived the travel sports life with my kids, and I have seen firsthand that if you're not careful, it'll take over. And we all have to make the decision whether or not you're going to allow that to be the case. I'm grateful that we do travel baseball and nothing else, and so it's an easier conversation for me. What happens when we become regular? And then there's this, last. I wonder if when we practice Sabbath, figuratively, literally, I wonder if we would create space to feel our level of connectedness. You know what seems to happen every Christmas, every Thanksgiving? Those seem to be the moments where we really reflect on how lonely we are or aren't. Have you noticed that? Because the shops are closed, and there's not as much going on, and we're off work, and we have there's a few of them programmed into our calendar where suddenly realize, if I was going to ask someone to go skiing, I don't even know if I have anyone to ask. What if part of the value of this is it creates space where we step away from our artificial friendships with screens and our over-occupation with work, and we begin to reflect on whether or not we are, in fact, lonely. I'm in a program right now at George Fox, which is a spiritual directing coursework, and I'm just kind of fascinated by the concept. It's kind of a buzzword in some places like Portland, and so I wanted to learn more about it, so I'm committed to kind of working myself through this certificate. Right now I'm in the second of 4 classes. The first one was last semester. The first thing they did in this kind of spiritual directing coursework, Dr. Bruner, who will be here in a couple of weeks, don't miss that, he put us in what he called a triad, which is simply a group of 3. And it was the weirdest thing I've experienced in some time, and it's been awesome, and I've actually practiced it locally here a little bit with some friends. But the triad is simply this. It's a type A's dream, by the way. Because I'm in a group with 3 other guys. We meet every other week for an hour. One of them's in Missouri, but not a Cardinals fan, so I don't like him that much. The other one's in Portland, so we meet on the computer. The structure is this. We get 5 minutes of just kind of introductory, kind of the stuff you do normally for the full hour because everyone's nervous about talking about anything that's real. So you get 5 minutes to do that. Then it rotates time. Someone takes out their iPhone, ironically, and they set a timer to 7 minutes. And one of the people, it's just talk. Like, just talk. Whatever it is. And if you're like, whatever you want to talk about, you talk about 7. Nobody gets to interrupt. Nobody gets to ask questions. Everyone just listens. Then there's a minute of silence, kind of this, what they call a prayerful silence. This gets weird. And then there's 7 minutes, so new timer, 7 minutes of what they call reflective listening. And there's some strict rules. No projecting, none of that like, oh, your dog died? I once had a dog died. And 4 minutes later, I'm done talking about myself. None of that. No advice giving, no like, here's what you should do or ought to do, or here's what you're not doing. It's just reflective listening, clarifying questions, kind of just asking for people to say more. All focus on this one person. Timer goes off, you stop, go to the next person. 7 minutes, 7 minutes. Timers go off, go to the next person. When I first heard of it, I thought, this is the weirdest thing I've ever heard. After the first time I did it, I was intrigued. After the second time, I was like, wait a minute. I'm actually referencing these conversations later in my week. And on some level, I'm experiencing firsthand exactly what Larry Crabb is saying. I'm not looking for anybody to give me advice. I know too. I once had a friend say to me, Adam, I could not go to church for the rest of my life and still not have enough time to do the stuff you're telling me to do. That's not the issue, is it? It's an issue of being known and understood and sharing your garbage. And looking at someone and going, that was superficial. I know there's more going on than that. Haven't done that yet, but I look forward to the day when someone else does it, not me. What if slowing down creates the space to go, wait a minute, I think I kind of could use something like that. I think I'm constantly around people, but I'm isolated and lonely. I don't know. Something to think about. But what if the bottom line is, to whatever degree you're feeling relationally disconnected, it starts by having a bit of a conversation with self and God and people that you trust, whether or not your own addiction to production and consumption is actually your connectedness undoing. And to whatever degree we can help you with that, let us know. I'd like to pray, God, Lord, we know that you made us for relationship, and we know that relationships are vulnerable and they're often disappointing and we get hurt. And yet when we get still enough to know it, we know that the relationships are one of the very few things that truly determine the quality of our lives. And so, God, would you make us the kind of people who take risks? Would you make us the kind of people who slow down enough to do some of the old-fashioned kind of weird stuff, like have people over for dinner and meet up over lunch and schedule in advance time with one another? Jesus, we pray that there's people in this room whose desire to follow you is genuine. Lord, we know that we learn nothing outside of the context of relationship, and so we pray that you would bring people into their life who know you and follow you, and you can encourage them in the kingdom endeavors that you have for them. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.